Imagine a civilization so advanced they managed vast empires with clinical precision from inside 40-foot-thick stone walls. Then, in a single generation, they vanished. Not by a grand army or a comet, but plunging into a hell so primitive they completely forgot how to read, write, and eventually how to be human. This is the Greek Dark Ages, a 300-year total collapse of the Mediterranean that history tried to bury. And the most terrifying part? The warning signs of their fall look exactly like our world today. Before the shadows fell, there was gold, trade, and the intricate bureaucracy of the Blood Kings. These were the Mycenaean rulers who inspired the tales of Agamemnon and Achilles, governing from massive stone citadels with walls 40 feet thick. These fortifications were so immense that later generations believed they were built by the Cyclopeans, one-eyed giants, because no mere man could have moved stones of such scale. They had a complex script known as Linear B, a flourishing economy, and a network of alliances that stretched across the known world. They were the peak of Bronze Age sophistication, managing every grain of wheat and every jar of oil with clinical precision. Then, in the span of a single generation, the palaces burned. The records stopped. The trade routes became graveyards. We are left looking at a 300-year gap in the human story, a period so desolate that it suggests a collapse beyond our modern comprehension. Historians often point to climate change, seismic activity, or mysterious invaders from the sea as the catalysts for this ruin. But these explanations fail to capture the sheer psychological weight of what followed. When the systems failed, the people did not simply find a new way to live. They fell into a primitive state of existence that bordered on the animalistic. The grand stone halls became tombs, and those who remained outside their walls faced a world where the sun still rose, but the structures of morality and society had been completely dissolved. In this forgotten hell, the most basic unit of human connection, the family, became a source of both protection and predation. As the harvests failed year after year and the granaries were looted by desperate bands of survivors, the concept of the unthinkable became a daily necessity. There are whispers in the archaeological record, hidden beneath layers of ash and bone, of communities that turned inward in the most horrific way possible. When there is no more grain and the livestock have been slaughtered, the only thing left to sustain the living is the living themselves. This was not a choice made in madness, but a calculated, cold survival tactic, born from a world that had forgotten the smell of rain. Evidence from ancient sites shows frantic fortifications and wells dug deep inside citadels to prepare for sieges that would never end. But the enemies were not always from across the sea. In many cases, the fires were started from within. The most chilling aspect of the Greek Dark Ages was the death of the mind. The script of the kings disappeared entirely. It was as if a collective amnesia had struck the population. People stopped writing because they no longer had anything to record, or perhaps because the past was too painful to remember. The stories of the great wars were no longer preserved on clay tablets. They became ghosts, whispered from mouth to ear around flickering fires in the ruins of fallen empires. For centuries, no one in Greece knew how to read or write a single word. Knowledge was a luxury that the starving could not afford. The collective intellect of a civilization was reset to zero, leaving a void where wisdom used to be. Imagine a child born into this darkness, walking through the skeletal remains of a city like Mycenaean. They would see walls built with stones so large they defied logic, and they would have no idea who built them or why. To this child, their ancestors were not men, but gods or monsters. The disconnect between the height of the Bronze Age and the depths of the Dark Age created a psychological rift that would define the human psyche forever. The fear that the world could simply break, that civilization is a thin mask over a hungry abyss, became the silent foundation of their later mythology. Every stone they touched was a reminder of a greatness they could no longer understand, making them feel like scavengers picking through the trash of giants. During these 3 centuries, the population plummeted. Some estimates suggest that over 90% of the people vanished. They did not all die in fires. Many simply walked away into the wilderness and were never heard from again. Settlements moved to high, inaccessible crags, driven by a pervasive fear of their fellow man. Trade, which once brought tin from the edges of Europe and lapis lazuli from the Far East, was replaced by a desperate local isolation. Every stranger was a threat, every shadow a potential predator. The Mediterranean, once a bustling highway of ideas, became a wall of black water. The silence was not just the absence of noise, it was the absence of progress. In most periods of history, even during war, there is an evolution of art and architecture. In this era, everything regressed. Pottery became crude. Homes became hovels. The intricate jewelry of queens was replaced by basic iron pins, used more for utility than beauty. We must ask ourselves, what happens to the spirit when it is forced to live in the ruins of its own greatness? When you are surrounded by evidence that your grandfathers were giants, and you are merely a survivor in the dirt, the shame must be overwhelming. This shame likely fueled the silence that followed. They did not want to be remembered. They did not want to leave a record of their desperation. The Dark Age was a period of collective hiding, a time when humanity tried to shrink small enough to escape the notice of fate. The Sea Peoples, often blamed for the initial collapse, remain one of history's greatest enigmas. They were a scorched earth migration, a tide of displaced tribes that moved like a virus. But they were only the spark. The fuel was the fragility of the systems themselves. The kingdoms were command economies, where everything was controlled from the center. When the center failed, the periphery did not just suffer, it disintegrated. There is a terrifying intimacy to the violence of this era. It was not the impersonal death of modern warfare, but a struggle for breath. The lower classes, tired of supporting the opulence of the warrior kings while the soil turned to dust, may have been the ones to finally put the torch to the palaces. The revolution, if that's what it was, brought no liberation, only a more egalitarian form of starvation. As the decades turned into centuries, the memory of the light began to warp. The historical kings were transformed into the gods of Olympus. The real-world catastrophes were reimagined as the whims of temperamental deities. The Dark Age was the womb of a new religion, one founded on the idea that the universe is indifferent to human suffering, and that the gods are as cruel and unpredictable as a sudden drought or a band of raiders. They did not pray for love, they prayed for mercy from the shadows. By the time the light finally began to return around 800 BC, the world was unrecognizable. When the Greeks finally relearned how to write, using a new alphabet borrowed from the Phoenicians, the first things they recorded were the echoes of that dark time. The Iliad and the Odyssey are not just adventure stories. They are the trauma of a people trying to make sense of a lost world. They are obsessed with the concepts of home and hospitality, precisely because those were the things that had been most violently stripped away during the darkness. The poems are haunted by the fear of being forgotten, a fear born from 300 years of total anonymity. The transition out of the darkness was not a sudden victory, but a slow, painful crawl. It began with small clusters of people realizing that they could survive better together than apart. It began with the first tentative trade ships venturing back out into the sea. But even as the Parthenon eventually rose and philosophy was born, the scar remained. The people never forgot that the darkness was there, waiting just beneath the surface. Their tragedies and their obsession with fate all point back to those centuries of silence. They understood that civilization is not a one-way street. It can be reversed. It can be erased. What if our own era is just as fragile? We live in a world of even greater complexity, more interconnected, and more dependent on invisible systems than the kings of old ever were. We rely on global supply chains, digital records, and a delicate balance of power. The Greek Dark Ages serve as a grim reminder that if the systems we trust were to fail tomorrow, the silence that follows would not be filled with our screams, but with the quiet, desperate sounds of a world trying to remember how to be human. But the reality suggested by the ash layers of the past is much simpler and much more frightening. Sometimes, things just end. Sometimes, the weight of maintaining a civilization becomes too heavy for the people living in it, and they choose to let it fall. They choose the darkness over the burden of the light. The survivors of that era did what they had to do. They forgot their names, they forgot their gods, and in the most extreme cases, they forgot their humanity. They did this so that eventually something new could grow. But the cost was 300 years of a hell that history has tried its best to forget.
Stop.
The Greek Dark Ages were not a lapse in history. They were a warning. They proved that the transition from a golden age to a primal struggle can happen in the blink of an eye. The silence of that era is a haunting melody that still plays beneath the noise of our modern world. It tells us that we are only as civilized as our last meal, and only as remembered as the last person who knows how to read our names. When the light goes out, the only thing that remains is the hunger, and the lengths we will go to satisfy it. We study the gold of the ancient palaces and the marble of the temples, but we must never ignore the 300 years of ash that lie between them. For it is in that ash that the true nature of humanity was revealed. Stripped of its masks, its titles, and its words, left to face the darkness alone. The silence eventually broke, but it left behind a world that viewed the gods not as benevolent creators, but as terrifying forces that must be appeased. This was a direct result of living through an era where nature and society had conspired to destroy everything. When survival becomes the only goal, the soul changes. It becomes harder, colder, and more focused on the immediate. The beauty of later Greek art and philosophy was, in many ways, a desperate attempt to cover up the horror of where they had come from. They built temples to Zeus because they remembered a time when the sky offered no rain. They wrote laws because they remembered a time when the only law was the knife. We marvel at the marble ruins of ancient Greece, seeing only the glorious birth of Western civilization. but we turn a blind eye to the 300 years of blood, ash, and absolute silence that forced it into existence. It's a chilling reminder. The invisible global systems keeping our modern world alive can fail in an instant. And when they do, the silence will be deafening. What do you think? Are we standing on the edge of our own dark age, just waiting for the center to break? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you want to unearth more forbidden history and redacted pasts, hit subscribe and open the next file from the history ledger. Remember, the darkness isn't just in the past, it's waiting.